You might have noticed that the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is a pretty big deal in the second book. This is because the English in Old England and in the New World saw it as a pretty big deal, as did the revolutionists a century later. I hope you'll see, as you move into the second part of the book, towards the American Revolution, the similarities between the two revolutions. Often we focus on the fact that the American Revolution was a Republican revolution that abolished monarchy, and so we see that as the defining purpose of the revolution. I think this misses the point. It misses their point. The fact that they used Republican rhetoric in 1776 shouldn't cloud our judgment about the goings-on here. The bone of contention in the revolutionary era, from 1763 to 1775, was not monarchy versus republicanism, but centralized power versus local power, arbitrary government versus government by consent. It's no different from the dynamics you read about in the Glorious Revolution in England, or the dynamics of aristocratic resistance that led to the issuing of the Magna Carta. Local governance was traditional and considered an ancient liberty in the classical sense. The governing principle of the English Empire, what we call salutary neglect, local communities governing themselves, this governing principle reflected that old world mindset about local governance. The empire's salutary neglect constitution, that is the empire's salutary neglect structure. The term constitution simply means how a government is constituted, how the government is organized, how it functions. So the empire's salutary neglect constitution allowed the old English habit of local governance to take hold and get entrenched in the New World, just like in the Old. Jack Green's article talks about this very thing. Administrative centralization, the centralization of government bureaucracies, the concentration of power in the central government, it violated those ancient unwritten liberties, rights, customs, and rules. It violated a broad and traditional agreement on the way we do things around here. This is exactly why these conservative revolutionaries were insistent on writing down those unwritten rules. They wrote them down in the 1215 Magna Carta, in the 1689 Bill of Rights, in the 1781 Articles of Confederation, in the 1789 Constitution, and the 1791 Bill of Rights. Such written constitutions are a striking feature of this English and American political culture. So it should force us to consider why. Why write down what beforehand were unwritten rules, unwritten liberties? So if we were in a physical classroom right now, I'd ask you all, what are written constitutions designed to do? Why write down on paper the way our government is structured? And you would respond and say that a written blueprint of how our government operates is designed to place hurdles in the way of future attempts to change the way our government operates, to make it harder for future kings, presidents, prime ministers, legislatures, and citizens to enact fundamental change to the way we do things around here. This governmental blueprint, what the government can and cannot do, what does the king do, what does parliament do, what does local government do, what is the government's relationship with the church, all these are constitutional things that people can know even if they're not laid out in a written constitution. For example, you and I know not to wear a hat indoors, not to burp at the table, not to cheat on our spouses, and yet these are not written down anywhere. We know because we live in this culture and we know its codes. But here, in 1215, and 1689, and 1781, and 1787, and 1791, we see the English and Anglo-Americans writing down these unwritten rules of government, explaining on paper how our government is constituted. The fact that they wrote down and disseminated these unwritten rules reflected a realization that these rules were not being observed. the unwritten rules against centralization were not sufficient to stop rulers from centralizing. I'll give you a great example from the news illustrating this very thing. Why is it that bills have been introduced in different state legislatures, some of them have already become laws, telling schools they're not allowed to punish students for playing with toy guns, using their fingers to make a gun, or nibbling their sandwiches and Pop-Tarts into the shape of a gun? Just Google Pop-Tart law and you'll find them all over the United States. So why did legislatures start passing them all of a sudden in the 20-teens? Why were there no such laws before the 20-teens? The answer is that before the 20-teens, we all understood, even teachers, that it's perfectly okay to play with toy guns or guns made out of Pop-Tarts. It was an unwritten rule of how we live together, and we all knew it. The reason this unwritten rule is turning into a written rule, into a written law in so many states, is that schools have expelled kids for these actions. So citizens have seen evidence that many teachers and principals and school boards actually do not know this unwritten rule. So citizens legislate it and write it down and disseminate it to the schools so that future teachers will learn from the written law what parents and kids already know from normal life in our society. By the same token, every provision you'll find in those written constitutions, from the Magna Carta to the American Bill of Rights, reflects the experience of past governments violating that written provision. It used to be unwritten because we all understood that the king or government can't do this, this, and this. Since evidence has shown that we don't all understand this, we're writing it down in order to teach future rulers and future constituents what is and is not appropriate in our system of government.